Welcome to the AIC podcast, where we share practical guidance and insight for members and help the industry understand how the agri-food supply chain works. I'm Wendy Ford. I'm the AIC Communications Manager, and in part 1, we explored soya's role and EU's EUDR. Today, we focus on the UK, what's in the Environment Act framework, how it differs from the EU model, and what that means in practice. With me again are Ed Barker, AIC Head of Policy and External Affairs, and James McCulloch, AIC Head of Feed. Let's get back into the practical issues for the UK. And how does the EUDR apply in Northern Ireland?
Complicated.
It's worth saying that that until recently, there's been quite a big discussion as to the extent of which EUDR actually applies in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
Which you'd like to think a basic question like that is something that we would have had clarity on much sooner. But sort of the working assumption from when EUDR was introduced was that it would apply in Northern Ireland, which we were slightly not mystified, but it was a bit quizzical because it's not it's not a sanitary, it's not a phytosanitary issue. It's maybe more of a customs issue. And whilst this has been kind of going on and on, we've been trying to get more clarity as to what the UK does about application in Northern Ireland. And I think was it about December last year, government basically came out and said that it wouldn't be regulating or implementing itself EUDR in Northern Ireland, and effectively said that was for the European Commission to do. So for traders in Northern Ireland who are trying to run their business in an operating in a legal framework that's so they know what they're compliant with, wasn't very helpful.
No, it wasn't. I mean, again, I think the government's line was saying that they didn't have the executive powers to appoint a competent authority, which would then implement the regulation in Northern Ireland. Certainly, our AIC member companies who are operating in Northern Ireland are largely serving a local market, but actually they would all be serving a market within the European Union, in other words, the Republic of Ireland and further afield, and they see the need to comply or be seen to be compliant with EUDR as an important market access issue. So if they're not able to demonstrate that they're compliant because the regulation is either not implemented or doesn't apply, that then presents challenges for them. But we'll hopefully see some clarity on that during the first half of 2026 as to how our government is going to manage EUDR in Northern Ireland.
Something tells me that we'll be back in similar position at Q3, Q4 this year, where we'll be asking the same questions as to exactly how what do businesses do on the ground there. I mean, I hope I'm wrong, but we've been doing it for the last 2 years, haven't we?
And that brings us to the UK's own position. Like, where do things currently stand with the UK's deforestation rules under the Environment Act?
Interestingly, towards the end of 2025, the various teams within DEFRA and other departments, I guess, reopened the conversations around what to do with the originally proposed UK forest risk commodity regulations. And I think that they were wanting to sound out industry and supply chain partners as to what their thinking was, not just around the original UK proposals, but what we also thought of EUDR. And it suggested to us that the government were perhaps prepared to open up the Pandora's box of the Environment Act 2021 and pull out the UK FRC proposals and I guess have another think about it, Ed. I don't know what you...
There are kind of two things at play. The first, which people do forget about, is that the legislation is already in place. So the Environment Act was passed in 2021, and within it, the whole deforestation requirements for the UK sit within the Environment Act. So it has already been legislated. The thing that it doesn't have is what we call the secondary legislation, which is where you take the overarching, the bit that gives ministers powers to put legislation in place, and then that's when you start doing the specifics as to how it will work. What is required exactly. What does a business have to report on? What does the process look like? And we've never gotten to that stage of the secondary legislation. We haven't been presented with how it works in practice, but it's just kind of sat there on the statute book, just kind of bobbing around in the high seas a bit without being implemented. So that's the UK from the one side. The second is that you have to look at obviously how the UK and the EU compare and contrast. And I have heard some people say, why can't we just adopt the EU proposals, copy and paste? Looking at how it's written in the Environment Act, it's quite specific as to how it would function. And I don't see how you could incorporate the UK proposals and effectively turn them into the EU's without fundamentally changing the primary legislation, which, as anyone who might follow political affairs will know, that's extremely laborious, and it's a big piece of work to change primary legislation. And I don't know how the two really would fit together. Looking at it, I can't see how you would just copy and paste the EU proposals to the UK, just like that. I think it is difficult, but to be fair to the government in the UK, they are aware that having two completely separate and different compliance systems in place. If you're a UK trader, if you're a UK business and you're operational in the EU and the UK, then having two systems that you're having to run for, what is effectively considered as one large market. If you're importing soy, it's Europe is a market, including the UK, and I think even they see that running parallel compliance systems is clearly burdensome for businesses, especially when the UK is just such a smaller part of the European market. So I think they do appreciate that, but it's, as ever, it's navigating a path that doesn't add considerable levels of complexity or, frankly, cost to businesses. Because, as we know, inflationary priorities is a massive part of government thinking right now, especially in food.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that, I mean, certainly the businesses that we represent within our part of the supply chain, I think generally would regard the proposals as outlined in the Environment Act in the UK as rather more pragmatic and manageable. As Ed says, so as a sort of an enhanced risk assessment exercise, reporting a year down the line. So in other words, a retrospective reporting of your activities, not preventing you from bringing materials into the market and assessing whether they are compliant at that point. So I think if we ask the question the other way around, we would say, well, is an appetite within the EU to adopt UK regulation? Well, of course there isn't, but we would, I think, prefer to hang our hat on what we saw of any of the original UK proposals, because we regarded them as being would achieve the same end in terms of deforestation, but do it in a more pragmatic way, really.
Another area that often causes confusion is how deforestation rules apply to animal products themselves. Can you explain what embedded commodities are and how deforestation regulations affect these kind of products?
Just to explain the principle of I think we've touched on it a little earlier, embedded commodities. So if you take an egg or a chicken on the retail shelf, they contain embedded soya on the grounds that the birds that have provided either the meat or the eggs will have been fed feed that contains soya. And so if you have a regulation that includes within their scope embedded commodities, it means that suppliers of said chicken and or eggs have to demonstrate that the soya in the feed that's been fed to those birds is compliant with the deforestation regulation. And I guess the significance of this is that the original UK proposals included embedded commodities, so you had to account for commodities in scope that were embedded in any number of thousands and thousands of different products, which is quite complex and challenging. EUDR does not include embedded commodities, so that's a significant difference.
I think if you're a European farmer, your main concern is probably price of the material itself. One of our European trade bodies, FIFAC, did a lot of work on assessing the cost impacts of the supply chain having to undertake geolocation, auditing, all of the additional work that's required to employ people to segregate that in the supply chain. So for a European farmer, it is basically the cost of that. And we know a lot of European farming groups last year became very vocal about additional costs of soy in feed, palm products as well. and what that meant for their competitiveness. It's an ongoing issue, I'm sure. And livestock farmers, in particular in the EU, obviously, is a number of protests that have happened. For the UK, yes, there is the cost implication, but the what we've been talking to farming unions here about is actually, if we take the UK proposals as written, then it's not just that, but it's also that they're in a position in the supply chain under the UK legislation where they are buying from businesses that are in scope and selling to businesses that are in scope. And the big question is, how do you facilitate the information of the soy that you've got in your supply chain from your feed company that you've bought the feed from, and provide that information to the milk processor or the meat processor who you're selling your livestock or dairy products to? And that's sort of a big question mark area that I don't think UK government have ever provided a proper answer on. Ultimately, I think that's the only answer we've had so far, is it's us in the supply chain that have to try and help provide solutions to that, which is something that I know that we've done as AIC with other supply chain bodies as well.
Yeah, I think again, it's providing that transparency and allowing that information to flow through the supply chain. So as you say, you're connecting basically the soy or other commodities, but soy, say, sourced from a farm in Argentina, all the way through to an egg or a chicken on the retail shelf in the UK. So that's the challenge of actually providing that information. What we can do in our remit, as far as AIC and the feed sector is concerned, is to ensure that we can pass that information on to our immediate customers, which would be livestock farmers, and or their customers, who would be processors, dairy processors, retailers, meat processors, and so forth. And we've developed our AIC Sustainable Commodities Standard to basically enable that information to flow through the through chain, because we haven't mentioned it, but that certain parts of our supply chain, as in processors and retailers, are going to be looking to specify deforestation-free, EUDR compliant product from their suppliers, irrespective of whether EUDR applies in GB, which we know it doesn't, or in Northern Ireland. So we know that there will be certain specific demands coming through the supply chain for this transparency, and we see it as I guess, one of our roles in the AIC to try and help facilitate that market to operate.
You've mentioned the need for transparency and verified information flowing through the chain. How does the AIC Sustainable Commodities Standard work, and how would it help businesses prove compliance with deforestation regulations?
So that basically is a scheme which would apply to importers of commodities that are within the scope of deforestation regulations, and manufacturers of feed using those commodities. And the idea is that they, to be a participant in the scheme, they would need to demonstrate to a third-party independent auditor that they have sufficient information within their businesses to demonstrate that the commodities they are handling, buying, and selling are compliant with the relevant legislation. So the first standard within the scheme is an EUDR aligned standard. We can't say it's compliant, because the only people that can confer compliance would be a competent authority or the EU Commission. But what we can do within the standard is say, would this commodity that's being sourced from overseas and placed in feed be compliant with the requirements of EUDR? And we can then pass on, if we have participants, member businesses who participate in the standard, they can demonstrate to their downstream customers, be they livestock farmers, processors, retailers, etc., that they are compliant with the requirements of the standard. And therefore, there's confidence that the material, the feed that they're supplying to those livestock farmers is also compliant, and hence that information can flow through the line. So it's an audit of an accounting exercise in terms of accounting for flows of material into the UK, into feed mills, and then out of feed mills onto farm.
That's great. And yeah, it's all available on our website. It's an open access area, so it's not restricted to members. So if you want to find out more, please head over to our website, agindustries.org.uk. And finally, taking a step back from all the detail, if our listeners were going to take away one thing from this podcast, what's the overall message you want them to take away?
I think from my point of view, so I guess looking at the feed sector, looking at members, looking at their customers, i.e. livestock farmers and so forth, It goes without saying it's a complex area, and it's been a long-running sort of saga, I guess, in terms of trying to deliver certainty around how these regulations will be implemented and the financial impact they will have, because they will definitely have some economic impact. So I'm guessing that really our role as AIC in the feed sector is to make sure that we are as well informed as we can be around how we think these regulations are going to land. We're obviously in very regular discussions with our European Federation FEFAC around EUDR. We're in regular discussions with UK government. We've made sure that the whole of the UK supply chain is also informed. So in other words, we are talking to farmers' representatives, all of the various livestock associations and so forth. We're talking to UK Soy Manifesto signatories, Regional Soy Group, WWF, any number of stakeholders who. So there are no surprises along the line in terms of how these things can be implemented and the challenges that regulation might present, and also any sort of cost implications. And the other thing, clearly, we've done is to try and facilitate the market to operate at whatever level it will operate by the introduction of the sustainable commodity standard that we were talking about. So, but if you're sitting in an office wondering how to, what to do about buying soy and what being unsure as to what you think might go on, well, by all means, get in touch. We might not have all the answers, but at least you might feel a little bit better by being told that you're not the only one who doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, soy underpins much of not just the UK's food system, but the global food system as well. And what is being proposed in terms of regulation in the UK and in Europe matters for that food system. It matters also for deforestation, of course. It matters for sustainability. It also matters for food security and inflation, which we can't overlook. And so if you're a farmer, if you're part of the supply chain, if NGO, policymaker, wherever it is that you sit, this will be something that will be maybe peripheral in some of the broadsheet newspapers over the next year, but it will matter because it's such a critical part of our whole food system, directly or indirectly, that the decisions that are taking place over the next year will matter considerably towards that. And it's a shared endeavor for everyone to make sure that we have legislative proposals that are also workable, that ensure the continuity of a working food system, and also that help combat illegal deforestation, which, as we all can agree, is an entirely shared endeavor.
That's great. Thank you so much for today. That's a wrap on part 2. We've compared EU and UK approaches, discussed timelines and politics, addressed Northern Ireland, and shared practical ways to keep information moving. For details on the AIC Sustainable Commodity Standard and resources mentioned today, visit our website. And as ever, we'll keep collaborating across the supply chain as the picture evolves. Thank you to Ed and James, and thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guests and do not necessarily reflect any organisation they represent. This content is for informational purposes only and should not be considered professional advice. Listener discretion is advised. Thank you.